If your lab test came back normal, but you still feel tired, inflamed, stuck, gaining weight easily, losing hair, dealing with skin problems, sleeping poorly, and feeling that something is clearly off, I need to tell you an important truth. Normal lab work does not always mean real health. That may be one of the most dangerous phrases in modern medicine. A lot of people hear, everything looks normal, and they go home thinking the problem must be stress, age, anxiety, or that it is all in their head. But very often that is not true. Very often the problem is real. It just was not looked for in the right way. I have seen this happen again and again. People walk into a clinic with a body that is clearly giving signals. Their waist is getting larger. Their energy is low. They are hungry all the time. Their hair is thinning. Their skin is worse. Their sleep is poor. They are struggling to lose weight. And still, they are told that everything looks fine. But they know something is wrong. Their body knows something is wrong. I am EDU Rodriguez, a pharmacist, biochemist, and health educator. And today I want to show you, in a simple and practical way, why so many blood tests miss important problems, which markers deserve much more attention, and how to stop confusing normal with optimal. Because here is the first point that changes everything. When a lab result falls inside the reference range, that does not automatically mean you are healthy. In many cases, it only means your number landed inside the statistical average of a population. And that detail changes everything. Now think about this with me. If the population is becoming more overweight, more inflamed, more insulin resistant, more tired, and more metabolically unhealthy, then the average of that population also becomes worse. So being average inside a sick population is not exactly a compliment. It is like being in a classroom where most students are underperforming and being told that getting the average grade means excellent performance. Not necessarily. It just means you landed in the middle of that group. And with lab tests, something very similar can happen. That is why I want to teach you to look beyond the phrase, "It is normal." Not so you become obsessed with lab numbers, and not so you start diagnosing yourself from internet videos, but so you ask better questions and understand that there are very common blind spots in the way many people are evaluated. One of the biggest blind spots is fasting glucose by itself. A lot of people go to the lab, check fasting glucose, see a value that does not look alarming, and assume their metabolism must be fine. But glucose alone can hide a lot. And this is where one of the most important concepts begins. Glucose can still look acceptable because the pancreas is working extremely hard behind the scenes. That brings us to insulin. For me, this is one of the biggest blind spots in everyday medicine. There are people whose glucose still looks decent, but whose insulin has already been elevated for years. Their body is working much harder than it should to keep blood sugar under control, and that effort comes at a cost. That cost often shows up later as insulin resistance, prediabetes, and eventually type 2 diabetes. I like to explain it like this. Imagine glucose is the trash appearing on the street. Insulin is the cleaning crew rushing in to remove it. If you only look at the street and it looks clean, you may think everything is fine. But maybe the crew is exhausted, working overtime, running at double speed, and about to collapse. That is what can happen when insulin rises long before glucose finally goes out of range. That is why fasting insulin deserves much more attention than it usually gets. In many cases, a person spends years with high insulin, gaining weight, feeling sleepy after meals, dealing with stubborn belly fat, struggling to lose weight, and showing signs of metabolic trouble. Yet nobody ever orders fasting insulin. Everyone keeps staring only at fasting glucose. And by the time glucose finally rises, the process has already been going on for a very long time. The body was screaming, but no one was paying attention to the right part of the conversation. Another helpful marker is the HOMA index, which uses fasting glucose and fasting insulin to estimate insulin resistance. I am not going to make this overly technical, because what matters here is the logic. It helps show how glucose and insulin are working together. And when that relationship is unhealthy, the entire metabolic system starts to suffer. Now let us talk about another important test, hemoglobin A1C. It is useful, yes, I like it, but it also has limitations. A 1C shows an average estimate of blood sugar over the past few months. The problem is that an average never tells the whole story. A person can look relatively stable most weekdays and still have major spikes on weekends. Another person may have repeated glucose swings that get hidden inside an average that does not look terrible. So yes, A1C is useful, but it should never be interpreted alone. When you combine fasting glucose, fasting insulin, HOMA-A1C, and the person's real symptoms and lifestyle, you get a much smarter picture. And since we are talking about glucose, I need to mention the dawn phenomenon. Many people wake up with high morning blood sugar and panic because they think they must have done something wrong the night before. Sometimes they did not. In many cases, that morning rise is linked to hormones like cortisol and also to insulin resistance and excess glucose released by the liver. The liver can release glucose early in the day, and this becomes more visible when metabolism is already dysregulated. So elevated morning glucose does not always mean the person ate sugar at night. Sometimes it means the body is overproducing glucose on its own. This is where one of the most important messages of this video comes in. You cannot interpret all of this in a shallow way. One isolated number can be misleading. Clinical context matters. Symptoms matter. Sleep matters. Stress matters. Waist size matters. Food matters. Lifestyle matters. Now I want to talk about nutrient deficiencies, because this is another area where people get falsely reassured all the time. A lot of people check minerals and vitamins and are told that everything looks normal, yet they still show clear signs of functional deficiency. And this can happen because blood is not always the best place to understand what is truly happening inside the tissues. Take magnesium, for example. Magnesium matters for energy, muscle function, sleep, insulin sensitivity, stress regulation, and much more. But a large portion of the body's magnesium is not freely circulating in the blood. So a normal serum magnesium does not always guarantee that the tissues are actually well supplied. Something similar can happen with other minerals and vitamins, depending on the context. And that helps explain why so many people remain symptomatic even though their standard labs seem reassuring. Vitamin B12 is another good example. Some people show a B12 level that looks acceptable on paper, but they still have symptoms that strongly suggest a functional issue. Fatigue, tingling, poor concentration, weakness, neurological complaints. In certain cases, looking only at the B12 number is not enough. There are other markers that can help the doctor interpret the picture more accurately. Now I want to move into a marker that I value a lot, C-reactive protein, or CRP. This is one of the windows into inflammation. And silent inflammation sits behind so many of the problems people slowly accumulate. Weight gain, insulin resistance, vascular damage, fatigue, pain, worse metabolic function, worse brain health. Some people are told their CRP is normal, but it is still sitting in a range that, in practical terms, suggests ongoing low-grade inflammation. And this is another common mistake, treating not catastrophic as if it were excellent. I do not like to think only in terms of overt disease. I like to think in terms of biological terrain. If the terrain is inflammatory, the body will pay for that sooner or later. And one of the most important messages here is this. If you want better lab work, you need a better terrain. That means reducing sugar, refined flour, ultra-processed foods, poor oils, excess alcohol, bad sleep, inactivity, and visceral fat. Because visceral fat is not just a cosmetic issue. It is metabolically active, inflammatory, and deeply disruptive to many markers. Now I need to talk about cholesterol, because this is one of the most misunderstood topics in health. A lot of people look at cholesterol as if it were automatically the villain. It is not that simple. Your body makes cholesterol. It is not some foreign invader. It is part of important structures and functions. The problem is that a shallow interpretation of cholesterol creates a lot of confusion. Looking only at total cholesterol and drawing fast conclusions can be very misleading. Not all low-density lipoprotein behaves in the same way. There are different particle types, different metabolic contexts, and different risk patterns. And all of that matters. A person with a bad metabolic profile, too many refined carbohydrates, high triglycerides, inflammation, and insulin resistance may have a much more concerning cholesterol pattern. Another person eating a cleaner diet with better triglycerides and a better metabolic environment may show a very different reality. That is why looking at cholesterol without looking at everything else can lead people in the wrong direction. Another interesting topic is cortisol. The problem with cortisol is that a single value may not tell the full story. Cortisol changes throughout the day. So depending on the case, one isolated blood test can be very limited. That is when the person's history, energy pattern, sleep, anxiety, and stress become essential. and sometimes more complete forms of evaluation make more sense. And finally, I want to touch on vitamin D. This topic also creates a lot of confusion. Many people see a normal value and assume there is nothing to discuss. But there is a difference between barely surviving inside a lab range and truly functioning well. Some people have vitamin D levels that a lab may accept, yet they still show signs that suggest functional insufficiency, especially when you look at the whole clinical picture. And here is something important. Sometimes you should not look at vitamin D in isolation. Depending on the case, other markers can help show whether vitamin D is actually being used well in the body. If you made it this far, I want you to hold on to one sentence. Normal lab work does not close the investigation when the body is still showing signs that something is wrong. If you are tired, struggling to lose weight, dealing with unstable blood sugar, losing hair, having skin problems, sleeping badly, carrying more abdominal fat, feeling inflamed, overly hungry, or low in energy, do not accept shallow answers. Do not automatically assume that everything is fine just because a few numbers landed inside a wide reference range. The smartest medicine is the kind that looks at symptoms, context, and the right markers. It is not the kind that hands you a sheet of paper and sends you home with everything looks normal while your quality of life keeps getting worse. So what do I want you to do from now on? First, stop confusing average with optimal health. Second, talk to your doctor about tests that truly make sense for your case, especially if you feel that something does not add up. Third, stop expecting the lab report alone to solve the mystery. Tests help, but daily habits are what transform the picture. At the end of the day, lab work is a snapshot. But your food, your sleep, your stress, your movement, and your body composition tell the full story. And when you improve the story, the snapshot usually starts improving too. If this made sense to you, subscribe to EDU Health Tips and share this video with someone who keeps being told their labs are normal even though they clearly feel unwell. And tell me in the comments, have you ever gone through that experience of being told everything looked normal while you knew something was still wrong?